Under the heavy gray sky of a Montana winter, the world felt like it was holding its breath. The wind rushed down from the mountains, biting through the cottonwoods and rattling the last brown leaves still clinging to the branches. On the banks of the Yellowstone River, the ice cracked, and somewhere a crow shrieked in the empty distance. Jessica's boots made a brittle crunch on the frozen earth, each step more hesitant than the last. In her arms, Ethan, small, silent, bundled in a coat that was too thin for the cold, clung to a faded teddy bear. His cheeks were red from the wind, his eyes wide, searching Jessica's face for something he could not name. She knelt, fighting to keep her hands from shaking, and pulled the collar up around his neck. She forced a smile, but her voice trembled. "Stay here, sweetie. I'll be right back. You have Bear, right?" Ethan nodded, hugging the bear closer, his lips pressed so tight they turned pale. The wind howled louder, swirling up little whirlwinds of icy dust. Jessica brushed his hair back, her fingers lingering, memorizing the curve of his cheek. She kissed him once, hard and quick. Then she stood, turned, and walked away, every step slower, her shadow long and hunched. Ethan watched as she moved toward the battered old truck. She fumbled with the keys, climbed in, and for a second her face was visible behind the windshield, blurred by tears. Then the engine coughed to life, and the truck disappeared down the rutted road, swallowed by the cottonwoods. Ethan was alone. The river below the bank was restless, dark water moving beneath a crust of ice. The wind bit through his coat, and his fingers started to go numb. He pressed his face into Bear's fur, trying to remember the warmth of Jessica's hug, the sound of her voice reading stories at night. His chest hurt, like all the air had gone out of him. He didn't dare cry. The tears would freeze on his cheeks. Every sound felt too loud now, the groan of river ice, the snapping of branches. Ethan's eyes darted to the shadows between the trees. He shifted his weight, unsure whether to stay or to try to follow. But the world felt huge, the sky so heavy it might fall. His breath fogged in the air, minutes stretched. It could have been hours. The clouds hung low, pressing down on the valley. Ethan hugged Bear so tight he could barely breathe. His feet tingled, then went numb. He wondered if Jessica really was coming back, or if he'd misunderstood. Maybe she was just getting something from the truck. Maybe she'd be back any moment. But deep inside, something colder than the wind began to settle. He looked up at the sky. "Mom?" His voice vanished in the wind, too soft, too lost. Nothing answered. Even the river seemed to quiet, listening. Time dragged. The trees seemed to move, bending together in secret conversation. Ethan's nose stung from the cold, and he started to rock back and forth, trying to keep warm. In the distance, the faintest sound reached him. Hoofbeats? Or just the wind, playing tricks? He squeezed his bear tighter, listening, hope flickering inside him. He didn't know what to do. Wait and hope, or try to wander into the trees. What if he left, and Jessica came back? But what if he stayed, and no one ever came? The sky darkened a little more. The cold gnawed at his toes. For a moment, Ethan imagined Bear talking, telling him to be brave, to hold on, that someone would come. But the only real voice was the wind, relentless and wild. A hawk soared high overhead, its cry slicing through the silence. Somewhere behind him, a twig snapped, a sharp, clear sound. Ethan's head whipped around, his heart thudded wildly. Was it Jessica? Was it someone else? But all he saw were the tangled cottonwoods and the endless sweep of prairie. Ethan's eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. He buried his face against Bear, trembling, the ache in his chest growing and growing. Then, just as he began to drift, caught between sleep and cold, hope and fear, a new sound grew, clearer this time. Hoofbeats, steady and slow, coming closer. The ground seemed to tremble beneath him. For a wild moment, Ethan thought it might be a dream, or the ghost of a story Jessica once told him. But the hoofbeats grew louder. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of something warm and alive, a musky, earthy smell. Ethan lifted his head. Between the trees, a shadow moved, bigger than a deer, its shape uncertain. The hoofbeats stopped. For a heartbeat, everything went still. Who would come for a forgotten boy? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Ethan's fingers, blue with cold, tightened on Bear. In the distance, something waited, just out of sight, as the first stars blinked through the clouds. The last light faded. The valley held its breath, and somewhere, hope, barely a flicker, refused to die. Miles away from the lonely riverbank, in the shadow of a rundown ranch that hadn't seen life in years, a brown mare named Sable jerked awake. Her breath curled in the cold morning air, nostrils flaring as she shook off the tangled dreams that haunted her sleep. The corral was half collapsed, slats broken and mud pooling around her hooves. For a moment, she just stood there, ears twitching, the world around her strangely silent. Sable wasn't young anymore. Her left ear bore a jagged notch, a memory from days long gone, from men who'd raised their voices and their hands. Once, she'd belonged to a herd, running wild through open fields. Once, she'd known purpose, trusted voices, even love. But that was before she was sold off, traded, finally left behind in this forgotten place. Now, something shifted in the wind, something she felt in her bones. It was a call, urgent and mysterious, and it sliced through the fog of her loneliness. The urge to move was overwhelming, a pulse deep inside her chest. She pawed at the ground, mud sucking at her hooves, eyes bright with something almost like fear or hope. Then, with a burst of energy, Sable lunged forward, testing the old fence. One panel gave with a groan and a crack. She surged through, mud splattering her belly, her sides heaving. For the first time in years, she was truly free, and it frightened her. Sable turned her head toward the north, the direction from which the wind carried the faintest trace of something: salt, fear, and childhood tears. She couldn't explain it, but it was a scent she recognized, the vulnerability of the lost. She set off, moving at first with uncertain steps, then faster, heart pounding as the landscape blurred around her. She ran through fields crusted with frost, brambles tugging at her mane. Each breath clouded the air. Her legs, stiff from years of standing idle, found a rhythm, old instincts flaring to life. Sable's chest burned, but she pressed on, driven by a need she didn't fully understand, a memory of long ago herding, of guiding the weakest, of keeping the flock together. As she galloped through the wild brush, a fox startled from the undergrowth and darted away. Crows burst from a pine, scattering into the sky. Sable didn't slow. She followed the call, ears pinned, muscles straining. The hills rose and fell beneath her, shadows lengthening as the sun struggled behind thick winter clouds. The wind shifted. The scent grew stronger, threaded with despair and something smaller. Stuffed animal fur, maybe, or salt from dried tears. Sable slowed, nostrils flaring, scanning the horizon. A lone hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp in the stillness. And then she heard it, a tiny, muffled sob carried on the wind. Guided by that sound, Sable found her way down to the river's edge. The bank was steep and icy, the ground slick. She stepped carefully, lowering her head to see better. There, huddled in the brittle grass, was a child, so small he seemed almost part of the earth. His knees were drawn to his chest, arms tight around a faded bear. His face was blotchy, his eyes wide with shock and cold. For a moment, neither moved. Ethan's breath stuttered in his chest. Sable watched him. One ear flicked forward, the other, forever marked, pointed back, listening for threats. They were both survivors, two castaways in a world that had given up on them. The wind gusted, making Ethan shiver violently. Sable took a careful step closer, lowering her head until her nose brushed the boy's cheek. He flinched, then blinked up at her, uncertain if she was real. Her breath was warm, misting around his face, smelling of hay and earth and something gentle. Ethan reached out, trembling, and tangled his fingers in her thick mane. Sable stood still, the child's touch like a spark in the winter gloom. She shifted her weight, positioning herself between Ethan and the biting wind. With a soft whicker, she encouraged him to press closer. Her body was solid, radiating heat, and she did not move away. For Ethan, this moment felt impossible. A brown mare appearing out of nowhere, gentle eyes and steady breath. He pressed his face into her neck, sobs shaking through him, and for the first time since Jessica had left, warmth returned to his body. Sable's heartbeat thudded steady, a song of comfort and belonging. Minutes passed, the world shrinking down to just the two of them. Sable kept watch, her head high, eyes scanning the horizon for danger. Ethan barely noticed the cold anymore. He whispered to Bear, voice thin, "She's real. She's staying." As if afraid she'd vanish like everyone else. Sable's memories stirred, being driven from her herd, abandoned by the ones she trusted. But this child's fear, the way he clung to her, awoke something fierce inside her. An old sense of duty, a will to protect. She would not leave him. As darkness gathered and the wind howled, Sable stood her ground. She snorted low, reassuring, sheltering Ethan with her body. The river was no longer so terrifying with the mare beside him. The sound of her breathing, the warmth of her fur, and the strength in her legs made Ethan believe, for a moment, that he might be safe. And so, on the frozen edge of the world, two lost souls, one boy, one battered mare, found each other. For the first time, hope felt real. Night crept in quietly, swallowing the colors from the sky and leaving behind a world of blue shadow and cold. Under a tangled stand of pine trees, Ethan curled up against Sable's side, his fingers still gripping her thick mane as if she might disappear if he let go. Above them, the branches caught the wind and whispered, needles hissing softly, like old women telling secrets in the dark. Sable knelt carefully beside him, her body curving protectively around the small boy and his battered bear. Every now and then, she shifted, making a low, reassuring snort, her breath billowing white in the frigid air. The ground beneath them was hard, crusted with frost. Each time Ethan's eyes fluttered open, his first instinct was to check that she was still there, that her warmth was not just a dream. He pressed his face into her coarse mane, inhaling the deep, earthy smell of horse and winter grass. Sable's heartbeat thumped slow and steady against his ear, and after a while, his own shallow breaths began to match her rhythm. It was a world stripped bare, two castaways on the edge of everything, sharing the small fire of warmth that their bodies created. The pain in Ethan's hands and feet faded, replaced by a dull numbness. He trembled, not from fear now, but from exhaustion, the kind that comes after too much hope and too much disappointment. He whispered into Bear's matted fur, the words so faint even Sable couldn't hear. "She's staying. She's real." His voice broke on the second word, uncertain, but the mare only shifted closer. Outside the shelter of the pines, the landscape was a wilderness of snow and shadow. The moon, thin and cold, peeked through the clouds. In the distance, the river moaned under the ice, a low sound that seemed to echo Ethan's own confusion. Sometimes he heard animals moving in the dark, the sharp snap of a twig, the distant call of an owl. He shrank deeper against Sable, burying his face until the world became only her warmth, her breathing, her silent promise. Sable, too, was haunted by memories. In her dreams, she saw the rolling fields of her youth, the safe press of the herd around her, the deep voice of her first owner who had sung to her on cold nights. Then, as always, came the memory of betrayal, of hands that shoved her onto a trailer, of fences that grew higher and narrower, until she found herself alone in that broken-down corral. Every sound in the wild made her flinch, but the boy's small hands, clinging to her mane, anchored her. His fear mirrored her own. Together they drifted in and out of sleep, never fully at rest. Sometimes Ethan dreamed he was back home, Jessica's voice calling from the kitchen, warmth and light spilling through the windows. Then he'd wake, and Sable would be there, solid, breathing, her brown eyes open in the darkness. The night grew colder. Sable rose to her feet, shaking the frost from her coat, then returned to Ethan, lying down again so that he could press against her side. The pines shielded them from the worst of the wind, but every so often a gust found its way in, making Ethan shudder. Sable responded each time, a gentle nuzzle or a soft nicker, and he clung to her, half awake, afraid to sleep and be left behind. Hours slipped away. The world outside was indifferent. No headlights on the distant road, no voices calling in the wild, just snow, darkness, and the endless hush of winter. At one point, Ethan's stomach twisted with hunger. He fished in his pocket, finding a single hard peppermint Jessica had given him weeks before. He sucked on it slowly, savoring the small, stinging sweetness, then tucked the wrapper carefully into his pocket. Sable watched, her eyes reflecting the moonlight, and when he finished, she lowered her head so that her muzzle rested beside his. He smiled, the first time in what felt like forever. Sable remembered hunger too, the ache in her belly after days without grain, the sharp bite of loneliness worse than any cold. But here, with this trembling boy curled against her, she felt something old and fierce spark inside her. She would keep him safe. She would not leave him. The hours dragged. Sable's ears flicked constantly, listening for predators or the return of the woman who had left the child. Each time Ethan stirred, she was there. When he whimpered in his sleep, she nudged him gently with her nose. When the cold became too much, she shifted, pressing her body closer, sharing every ounce of warmth she had left. Toward dawn, Ethan woke again, fingers tangled in her mane. He blinked sleepily, his nose red and raw, but his eyes clearer now. "You're not going, are you?" he whispered. Barely more than a breath, Sable only nickered softly, her warm eyes meeting his. Ethan let himself believe just a little that she meant to stay. As light crept into the woods, the pines glowing pale silver, Ethan found he was still alive. The fear was still there, of hunger, of loneliness, of the world beyond the trees. But beside Sable, he felt braver. He pressed Bear's paw against the mare's nose and smiled when she snorted, the sound low and amused. Outside, the world was waking. Somewhere, a raven called. The river ice moaned, softer now. But under the sheltering branches, a small boy and a battered brown mare faced the day together. They were still alone, but now not quite as lost. That was enough, for now. Dawn unfolded slowly, thin blue light leaking through the pine branches, painting frosty shadows across the forest floor. Sable was the first to stir. She lifted her head, ears pricked, scanning the quiet world beyond their shelter. She nudged Ethan gently with her velvet nose, the touch soft but insistent. He shivered and rubbed at his eyes, the ache of cold and hunger pulling him awake. The mare nudged him again, just enough to say, "Get up, move, survive." Ethan hesitated, afraid to let go of the patch of warmth they'd made together. But Sable pressed closer, her huge brown eye watching him. With a sigh, he tucked Bear inside his coat and pushed himself to his feet, nearly falling. His knees wobbled. He felt small and shaky, like a fawn just learning to walk. Above them, the sky was the color of old slate. The air stung with the promise of another long, frozen day. Ethan's breath came in quick, cloudy bursts. His fingers curled into fists to chase away the numbness, but the cold bit through everything. Sable walked forward, pausing every few steps to look back at him, waiting. Her mane was tangled with burrs, her hooves caked with frost. Still, she moved with purpose, as if the forest itself was giving her directions. Ethan followed, stumbling along behind, clinging to her tail when the brush grew thick. The pines gave way to stretches of open, snowy ground, the world vast and eerily silent. For a while they traveled in silence, Ethan shuffling through snowdrifts up to his knees, Sable pushing through brambles with her shoulder. In the stillness, every sound was magnified. The crunch of hooves, the faint gasp of Ethan's breath, the distant scream of a hawk. Ethan's stomach growled so loudly it startled him. He glanced at Sable. "I'm hungry." The mare turned her head, as if she understood. She pushed her nose into his coat, searching for anything, a crumb, a scent, a promise, but there was nothing left. They trudged on. Mountains loomed in the distance, sharp and blue, their edges lost in morning mist. The river, half frozen, paralleled their path, its surface gleaming with shattered ice. Once, Ethan slipped on a patch of slick grass and fell hard. For a moment he lay there, blinking up at the sky, too tired to move. Sable circled back. She stood over him, shadow blotting out the weak sun, and pawed at the ground with her hoof. Her breath touched his cheek. Ethan managed a weak smile and pushed himself up, clutching her mane for support. The journey grew harder as the morning wore on. Ethan's legs burned. His feet ached with cold. He dragged his toes, sometimes tripping, sometimes just shuffling, willing himself not to give up. Whenever he faltered, Sable would pause, waiting, letting him rest his hand on her neck until he could continue. At one point, a startled jackrabbit burst from a thicket, sending Sable rearing in alarm. Ethan froze, his heart hammering. But the danger passed, and the mare settled, lowering her head to nuzzle his shoulder in apology. The wind picked up, swirling snow around them, blurring the path. Ethan squinted, eyes watering. Each step felt heavier than the last. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, its light was thin and cold. As they climbed a gentle rise, Ethan's vision swam. His head felt light, his thoughts muddled by hunger and exhaustion. He stumbled, fell to his knees, then collapsed onto his side in the snow. He wanted to get up. He wanted to keep going, but his arms wouldn't listen. The world seemed to shrink down to a small, spinning circle. White snow, gray sky, the steady thump of Sable's hooves. He heard her whicker, felt her warm breath on his cheek, but he couldn't open his eyes. Sable stood over him, nostrils flaring. She circled, anxious, pawing at the snow, then leaned down and nudged him. First gently, then harder, as if commanding him to wake. When Ethan didn't move, she let out a piercing whinny, a sound that echoed through the silent woods. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked in response. Ethan moaned. His eyelids fluttered. Sable kept pawing, her movements urgent, until he finally stirred. He blinked, dazed, then focused on her face. The mare nickered low, her eyes pleading. With the last of his strength, Ethan sat up, shivering violently. He clung to Sable's mane, burying his face in her neck, drawing warmth and courage from her presence. She stood steady as stone, giving him time to gather himself. When Ethan finally looked up, the world seemed different. There, through a break in the trees, a tiny flicker of light. It was faint, easily mistaken for a trick of the sun, but it glimmered, golden and real, on the other side of a snowy field. He stared, unable to believe it. "Do you see it?" he whispered, breathless. Sable shifted, her ears pricking forward. She took a step toward the light, then stopped, waiting for Ethan. Together they inched forward, Ethan stumbling, Sable guiding him, both drawn by hope they hardly dared trust. As they moved closer, the light sharpened into a window. The yellow glow of a ranch house, sturdy and promising, standing alone against the wild. Smoke rose from a chimney. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked again, closer this time. Ethan's heart thudded with fear and longing. Was it real? Would they be welcome or turned away? He squeezed Bear tight, his knuckles white. Sable pushed ahead, resolute. The promise of safety was enough. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the field, the battered mare and the lost boy pressed on toward the only hope they'd seen in days, a light in the wilderness, a chance to begin again. And for the first time, Ethan believed they might actually make it. The barn door rattled so hard it sounded like the wind itself was trying to claw its way inside. Cameron sat bolt upright in bed, heart pounding, sweat damp on her brow. For a split second, she thought it was just another nightmare, the same one where she ran through snow, always arriving too late, the world always slipping through her fingers. But the pounding came again, sharp and wild, echoing through the rafters of her old ranch house. Then the frantic neigh of a horse and a thin, broken voice, barely more than a whimper. Cameron fumbled for her boots and a faded flannel, nearly tripping as she sprinted for the back door. The cold hit her like a slap, sharp, alive, snapping her out of her sleep fog. She grabbed a flashlight and swung the beam toward the barn. There, silhouetted by the weak light, stood a sight so strange it knocked the breath from her chest. A battered brown mare, mud crusted up to her knees, stood guard over a small boy. The child was barefoot, cheeks purple with cold, clutching a ragged teddy bear in one hand and the horse's tangled mane in the other. His eyes were huge, terrified, darting between the barn and the house. For a moment, Cameron just stared, frozen by fear and confusion. It had been so long since anything unexpected, anything alive, had come stumbling up her driveway. She gripped the doorframe, fighting the urge to run back inside and bolt the lock, but the boy swayed on his feet, and the mare let out a desperate whinny, her head swinging toward Cameron as if begging for mercy. something deep inside Cameron cracked. The part of her that remembered loss, that remembered the ache of being left behind, the years of closing herself off, finally budged. She raced forward, dropping to her knees beside the boy, feeling the sting of snow seep into her jeans. "Hey, sweetheart. Hey, it's okay," she murmured, wrapping her arms around the trembling child. His skin was ice. She shrugged out of her flannel and wrapped it around him, tucking his hands inside, then scooped him up, blanket and all. The mare pressed close, her massive head bumping Cameron's shoulder. For a heartbeat, she was afraid the horse might rear, but instead, Sable just stood there, breathing hard, eyes locked on the boy. Cameron realized she was shaking too, not just from the cold, but from the fear of opening herself again. She should turn them away, lock the doors, call someone else to deal with this mess. That was the rule out here. Trust no one, help no one, keep your world small and safe. But as she carried the boy inside, the decision was already made. She'd made it the moment she saw his eyes. In the kitchen, Cameron set him by the stove, fumbling with the old iron dial until the fire sparked and heat began to fill the room. She wrapped a wool blanket around his shoulders and rubbed his hands, trying to coax color back into his cheeks. The boy watched her with an expression so raw and wounded, it made her throat close up. Outside, Sable pawed the earth, blowing nervous steam. Cameron hurried to the barn, grabbed an old bucket, and filled it with warm oats and water. The mare followed her, never letting the barn door close between them. As Sable ate, Cameron stroked her tangled mane, whispering, "You did good, girl. You brought him home." Back in the kitchen, Cameron found the boy slumped in the chair, still clutching his teddy. She knelt in front of him, voice gentle. "Can you tell me your name?" He just blinked, lips pressed together, jaw set. Silent. Cameron's heart twisted. She'd seen that look before, in her own mirror, after everything fell apart. The look of someone who didn't believe in rescue anymore. She went to the pantry, found a can of chicken noodle soup, and set it to heat on the stove. As it simmered, she pulled up a chair across from the boy, letting the silence stretch. She didn't push him. Instead, she talked softly, telling him about the ranch, about her old dog who used to chase deer down by the river, about how winter always made her wish for spring. The boy's gaze drifted to the window. He seemed to listen, though he never spoke. When the soup was ready, she ladled it into a chipped blue bowl and set it before him. He stared at it, unsure. Cameron picked up a spoon and blew on it, then tasted it herself, smiling. The boy copied her, taking a tentative sip. Color slowly crept back into his cheeks. The mare, never far, stood watch at the window. Occasionally, she whinnied, as if to check on her charge. Cameron remembered, with sudden clarity, the years when she'd needed help and nobody came. The years she'd learned to be her own savior, patch her own wounds, trust only herself. But looking at the boy and the mare, whose eyes mirrored the same pain, she realized something new. Maybe survival wasn't just about shutting the world out. Maybe sometimes it was about letting someone else in. As the night deepened, Cameron laid out a cot by the stove, piling every blanket she owned on top of the boy. She let Sable rest in the barn, a thick layer of straw beneath her and a heavy quilt over her back. She paused in the doorway, looking back one last time at the two castaways she'd found on her doorstep. For the first time in years, her house felt alive. Uncertain, yes, but full of possibility. Cameron pressed a trembling hand to her heart. She whispered to the sleeping boy, "I promise, I won't let you be alone. Not anymore." And for a moment, with the wind rattling the windows and the warmth of the stove holding back the dark, hope flickered quietly to life. Fragile, but real. The morning came heavy and white, snow swirling past the window panes, as if the whole world was wrapped in gauze. In the kitchen, the old radiator groaned, fighting to warm the corners where the cold clung stubbornly to the walls. Cameron woke to the sound of silence. No voices, no music, just the faint crackle of embers in the stove and the hush of breath from the cot by the window. She sat up and studied the small bundle curled beneath layers of blankets. Ethan's face was peaceful but pale, his brow knit as if even sleep couldn't quite erase the memory of what he'd lost. The teddy bear was tucked under his chin, one paw sticking out, threadbare and brave. Cameron moved quietly, lighting the stove, ladling water into an old enamel kettle. She took a deep breath, steadying her hands before reaching for the chipped blue bowl she'd used the night before. Outside, Sable's soft whicker drifted through the glass, a low, rumbling call that seemed to answer some question she hadn't yet asked. After a while, Ethan stirred. His eyes fluttered open, darting around the unfamiliar room, searching for danger or escape. But there was only Cameron, standing at the stove, and Sable's shadow at the barn window. "Good morning," Cameron said, keeping her voice low, the way you might speak to a skittish colt. "You're safe here. I made some oatmeal. There's honey if you want." Ethan said nothing, but he didn't flinch when she set the bowl before him. He took a careful bite, as if testing whether the food was real, then another and another, hunger slowly pushing out fear. Cameron sat at the table sipping coffee, watching him from the corner of her eye. She knew better than to push for answers. Instead, she talked, softly, almost to herself, about the way the snow made everything quiet, about her chores for the day, about the stubborn rooster who always escaped his pen. Ethan listened, his eyes darting between her hands and the window, never settling for long. When he finished eating, Cameron showed him where to wash up, handing him a soft towel. She let him move at his own pace, never crowding him. Afterward, she pulled out a tin of crayons and a stack of old coloring books, setting them on the table. Ethan hesitated, then chose a crayon, scribbling silently, the lines growing bolder as he worked. Outside, Cameron went to check on Sable. The mare greeted her with a low nicker, pressing her nose into Cameron's shoulder. Cameron ran her fingers through Sable's tangled mane, working out burrs and knots. She brushed the mud from the mare's coat, talking softly the whole time, as much for her own comfort as Sable's. "There you go, girl," she murmured. "You've had a rough time, huh?" "Me too." Sable sighed, her breath warm and sweet, as if she understood. By noon, the kitchen felt almost like a home. Ethan giggled when Sable poked her head through the barn window, her lips hunting for the carrot Cameron had tucked in her pocket. He reached out shyly, and Sable took the treat with gentle patience, her lips brushing his fingers. The boy laughed, a bright, surprised sound, and for a moment, Cameron felt the knot in her chest loosen. After lunch, Cameron brought out an old deck of cards. She showed Ethan how to play Go Fish, her voice light and patient. The first time she asked, "Do you have any threes?" Ethan shook his head, eyes wary. But on the third round, he whispered, "Go fish," his voice almost too soft to hear. Cameron smiled, letting the silence linger between them, never pushing for more. She talked about the ranch, about the partner she'd lost years ago, the way winter had a way of making everything feel bigger and emptier. Her words were gentle confessions, pieces of herself she hadn't shared in years. When the chores called, she showed Ethan how to help, scooping grain for Sable, filling buckets with fresh water, sweeping the floor of the barn. The boy followed her instructions, his movements careful and precise, always glancing at her for approval. Sable stayed close, nickering when he passed, as if reminding him that she was still there. That night, after dinner, Ethan finally spoke his name. He clutched Bear to his chest and whispered, "My name is Ethan," his voice trembling but proud. Sable, standing by the table, let out a soft nicker as if in approval. Cameron knelt beside him, her hands gentle on his shoulders. "Thank you for telling me, Ethan," she said, and her voice shook a little, but she smiled anyway. "I'm Cameron, and that's Sable. We're glad you're here." Ethan hugged his teddy bear tighter, and Sable pressed her head against his back, her eyes half closed in quiet peace. Later, as the wind rattled the eaves and the world outside disappeared behind a curtain of snow, Cameron sat by the fire, sewing a patch onto Ethan's coat. She told him a story about the first horse she'd ever owned, about falling off and getting back on, about trusting herself when nobody else would. Ethan listened, his head on her knee, Sable resting at his feet. In that small kitchen, trust grew slowly, like a seed pushing through frozen ground. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. But for the first time in years, Cameron realized she wanted to protect these two, not just shelter them for a night, not just keep them alive until the storm passed. She wanted them to stay. As the night settled in, the old fears lingered at the edges. Fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of loving something that might be taken away. But in the quiet, surrounded by the sound of Ethan's breathing and the steady presence of Sable, Cameron felt a new resolve building inside her. She wouldn't let them go. Not now. Not ever. The storm came suddenly, blowing in from the north, white and furious, burying the ranch in a world of drifting snow. By early afternoon, the sky was iron gray, and the wind screamed across the fields, shaking the house until it creaked in protest. The world outside disappeared, swallowed up by the blizzard's rage. Inside, Cameron worked quickly, double-checking the generator and laying extra wood by the stove. She moved through the house on muscle memory, pulling down lanterns, piling blankets by the windows, checking and rechecking everything she could control. But some fears, like the ones that haunted her dreams, could not be barricaded against. Ethan helped in small ways, carrying wood, arranging canned soup on the table, eyes wide with worry. Sable paced the barn at first, her body tense, muscles rippling under her battered coat. Whenever Ethan opened the back door to look out, Sable appeared in the window, her breath fogging the glass, checking on her boy. As the afternoon faded, the power flickered, then finally died, leaving them in a hush of candlelight and the low, hungry glow of the wood stove. The wind rattled the panes so fiercely that every gust felt like a threat. Ethan pressed himself close to Cameron, clutching Bear to his chest, his breaths quick and shallow. For a long time, neither spoke. Cameron knelt beside him on the rug, her hands smoothing his hair, her own heart thundering. Outside, the storm howled. It reminded Cameron of the long, lonely winters after she lost her partner, the kind where grief prowled the house, growing heavier each time she locked another door. Back then, she'd felt like she was sinking in snow that never stopped falling, no matter how hard she tried to dig out. Now the weight of the moment pressed down on her, familiar and terrifying. Ethan trembled, tears starting to streak down his face. "I want my mom," he whispered, barely audible, the words brittle with heartbreak. Cameron gathered him into her arms, rocking him gently, fighting to keep her own voice steady. "I know, sweetheart. I know. You're not alone. Not anymore. I'm right here." He sobbed, fists twisting the fabric of her shirt, and for a while Cameron could only hold him, letting the storm drown out everything but his pain. When his tears finally slowed, she whispered, "Do you want me to sing?" He nodded, face pressed against her shoulder. Cameron's voice was shaky, soft, just above the wind and the crackle of the fire. She sang an old lullaby, one her grandmother used to sing on nights when the world felt too big. The words wrapped around them both, threadbare and gentle. As she sang, Sable stood guard outside the window, her silhouette blurred by snow and darkness. She watched the light flicker inside the house, shifting her weight, occasionally nickering low and soft as if humming her own song. Her presence, steady and unflinching, made the storm less frightening. Every so often, Ethan peeked through the window, reassured by the shape of his brown mare waiting just beyond the glass. Later, with the storm still raging, Cameron carried Ethan to the small bedroom and tucked him under a pile of blankets. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding his hand until his breaths grew slow and regular, the nightmares held at bay by her touch. But when she finally let go and stepped into the hall, her own hands shook. The truth was, she was as afraid as Ethan, afraid of losing what little hope she'd found, afraid of failing another lost soul. She went to the kitchen and leaned against the cold sink, eyes closed, listening to the wind rattle the walls. She remembered the first winter after her partner died, how she'd stopped answering the phone, stopped feeding the horses on time, how she'd let herself believe that the world was safer without anyone left to lose. But that wasn't true. Not really. The loneliness had become its own storm, as cold and relentless as the one outside. It had taken years for her to admit that closing off had only made the pain sharper. Now, as she looked back at the closed bedroom door, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind she'd clung to before, but a slow, stubborn hope, built on the possibility of healing. She went out to the barn, bundled against the cold, and found Sable standing with her head over the door, watching the house with those wise, worried eyes. Cameron brushed the snow from the mare's coat and laid her cheek against Sable's neck. "You brought him here, didn't you?" Cameron whispered. "You kept him alive when I might not have. Thank you." Sable nickered softly, her breath warming Cameron's hair. That night, with the storm still raging, Cameron made a quiet promise to herself. She would not fail this boy. She would not fail this mare. She would not run from hope. When she returned inside, she found Ethan sleeping soundly, Bear tucked under his chin, the lines of worry eased from his face. Cameron sat on the floor beside his bed, listening to the storm and feeling, for the first time in years, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. As midnight passed and the blizzard began to wane, a new kind of quiet settled over the ranch, a quiet full of hard-won peace, of trust growing in the dark, of old wounds slowly, stubbornly, beginning to heal. When morning finally broke, the storm had left the ranch draped in white silence. The fields were a blank canvas, sparkling under a pale sun, every tree and fence post frosted with a fresh coat of snow. Inside, the wood stove crackled, and the air was thick with the warm scent of oatmeal and coffee. Ethan ate breakfast at the table, sleep still heavy in his eyes, but there was a new softness in his expression, a fragile sense of safety. Sable nickered from the barn, impatient for her morning oats. Cameron poured a bucket and trudged outside, boots crunching over snow that reached her shins. She stroked the mare's neck, grateful for the solid, living presence. "You're a hero, you know that?" she whispered. Sable snorted, flicking her tail. Back in the house, Ethan watched from the window, Bear clutched in his lap. The blizzard felt far away now. The night's fears melted in the gentle hush of morning. Cameron finished her chores and sat beside him, tucking a loose strand of hair behind his ear. The peace didn't last. Just as she was teaching Ethan how to braid hay twine, his little fingers clumsy but eager, an engine rumbled up the snow-packed drive, shattering the calm. Cameron's heart thudded. Few people ever came out this far without a reason, especially after a storm. A battered Ford pickup slid to a stop outside. The doors banged open, and two figures in heavy parkas climbed out, moving quickly, purposeful, determined. The taller one, Kyle, was a volunteer from the local search and rescue crew, a man Cameron had seen around town but barely spoken to since her partner died. He called out, voice echoing across the snow. "Anybody home? Sheriff sent us. There's a missing kid from over by the river." Cameron stiffened, instinctively moving in front of Ethan. The boy's face blanched. He shrank back, clutching Bear so tightly, Cameron worried the stuffing might burst out. The second volunteer, a woman with sharp eyes and a gentle smile, spotted Ethan through the window and waved. Cameron opened the door, shoulders tight. "He's here. I found him last night. Or more honestly, his horse found me." Kyle stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots, gaze flicking over Ethan, then to Cameron, then back again. "That's him, all right. We've been looking all night. His mom's car was found by the river. Whole county's on alert." Ethan shrank even further, knuckles white on his bear. Cameron felt a tangle of emotions, relief, dread, and something more stubborn, the kind of protectiveness she hadn't felt in years. She drew Ethan close, steadying her voice. "He's safe now. I gave him food, let him sleep by the fire. The mare, Sable, she never left his side." Kyle's eyes softened a little. "Glad you were here, but we have to call Child Services, Cameron. The sheriff's orders." A cold fear knifed through her. She remembered the system all too well. Bureaucracy, rules, good intentions swallowed by red tape. She pictured Ethan shuffled through foster homes, Sable left behind, both torn from the fragile family they'd just begun to build. Cameron squared her shoulders, meeting Kyle's eyes. "He just needs some time, somewhere safe. Let me keep him here, just until things settle down." Kyle shook his head, regret in his eyes. "It's not up to me. If it were, I'd leave him right here. But we have to follow protocol." The woman stepped forward, kneeling by Ethan's chair. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked gently. He didn't answer, but Sable, sensing his distress through the frosty barn window, let out a whinny that made everyone pause. Cameron pressed on, desperation sharpening her words. "I've got space here. I was a foster parent before. I know how to take care of kids who've lost too much." Kyle studied her face, his own guarded. "That's not a decision I can make, Cameron. But maybe, if you're willing, you can start the paperwork. Might help your case when the caseworker comes. Show them you're serious." Ethan looked up at Cameron, panic in his eyes, as if he could already feel the world slipping away. Cameron reached for his hand and squeezed it tight. her own voice trembling now. "I'm not letting you go, kid. Not if there's any choice left." A strange, tense dance played out in the little kitchen. Cameron defending her new family. Kyle caught between rules and what felt right. The woman softly promising, "We'll do what we can. But there will be questions. Someone from the state will have to come see for themselves." The rescue crew radioed the sheriff, giving updates, speaking in clipped voices. Outside, the snow sparkled. Sable pawed anxiously at the barn door. Finally, Kyle pulled Cameron aside, lowering his voice. "If you want a real shot, you've got to apply as a foster guardian. Let the caseworker see you with him and the mayor. If they see a real bond, it might be enough to keep him here." He paused, his tone gentler. "The system's not perfect, Cam, but sometimes it listens." Cameron nodded, resolve firming in her chest. She crouched in front of Ethan, meeting him eye to eye. "You hear that? I'm not giving up. We're going to fight for you. For Sable, too." Ethan hesitated, then threw his arms around her neck. For the first time, Cameron felt the shape of hope. Stubborn, messy, but alive. Kyle and the woman left, promising to return with a caseworker. Cameron watched them drive away, 100 worries burning in her mind. But for the first time, not just fear, there was possibility too. That night, as the sun set gold and pink across the fields, Cameron sat on the porch with Ethan on her lap and Sable grazing nearby. She stared at the snow, feeling the throb of risk and love in her chest. They would face the outside world, whatever it brought, together. The days after the storm were softer, snow slowly melting under the weak March sun, drip by drip, until patches of muddy earth appeared around the ranch. Winter's grip loosened, and for the first time in months, the wind didn't cut straight to the bone. It was a season of waiting and wondering, of hope and fear living side by side. Inside the house, Ethan started to blossom. He was still quiet, still haunted sometimes by dreams he couldn't describe, but laughter began to seep into his days. Cameron let him find his own rhythm. Some mornings he was up early, helping her haul wood or measure out oats for Sable. Other days he curled in the hayloft with Bear, hiding from the world until she coaxed him out with a promise of stories or pancakes. The ranch seemed to come alive with him. Cameron taught Ethan how to gather eggs, how to spot the first brave shoots of green pushing through the thawing ground, how to brush Sable's mane until it shone. They mended fences together, Cameron hammering, Ethan carefully holding each nail. His hands, at first timid and clumsy, grew stronger and more confident with every passing day. Sable watched over Ethan with the vigilance of a mother, always near, always patient. She let him lean into her side, his face buried in her fur whenever shadows from the past crept in. Sometimes, when Ethan's nightmares woke him in the dark, he would sneak out to the barn, curl up in Sable's stall, and let the steady sound of her breathing calm his heart. Cameron felt herself changing too. She found herself humming as she worked, catching glimpses of her old self, the woman who once believed in fresh starts. She learned to braid Ethan's hair, learned to read his moods in the way he gripped his bear or hesitated in doorways. She let him help with Sable's old wounds, showing him how to clean and salve a scrape, how to move slow and gentle so the mare would trust his hands. Spring came in fits and starts, muddy, hopeful, unpredictable. One afternoon, a robin built its nest above the porch, and Cameron took that as a sign. New life, second chances, but the outside world hadn't forgotten them. The caseworker arrived one bright morning in a gray sedan. Linda, Her name tag neat and official, her smile practiced but kind. She moved through the house with a notebook in hand, asking questions that made Cameron's palms sweat. Has Ethan spoken about his mother? Does he have nightmares? How does he act around Sable? Around you? Ethan hid at first, silent behind Sable's broad chest, peeking out with wary eyes. Linda took her time, kneeling to offer Sable a carrot, complimenting Ethan's drawings taped to the fridge. Gradually, the tension in the house eased. Linda watched everything. How Ethan's hand never left Sable's mane. How Cameron reached for him instinctively. How laughter, real and bright, lived in the air. She saw the small signs. A patched coat, muddy boots by the door, 2 bowls for soup instead of 1. The hard questions came later, when Ethan was outside throwing sticks for Sable to chase. In the living room, Linda sat with Cameron, her eyes sharp and honest. You know this isn't easy, Linda said, voice gentle but firm. We want what's best for Ethan. There will be a hearing. A judge will want to know what happened, why his mother left him, whether this is the right place for him to heal. Cameron's hands shook. I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes. I closed myself off for years. But I love that boy. I love that horse. We've built something here. Something real. Linda nodded. And do you think you're ready to keep building it, even when it's hard? Even if there are days when he pushes you away? Cameron's answer was quiet, but unwavering. Yes, I won't give up on him. I promise. The day of the hearing arrived, all nerves and tight shoes and waiting in the courthouse lobby. Cameron wore her best jeans, hair braided neatly, Ethan by her side in a clean flannel shirt, Sable's lucky horseshoe tucked in his pocket. Inside the small courtroom, the judge listened with tired eyes. Linda spoke first, describing the changes she'd witnessed, the laughter and trust that had begun to grow. She noted Ethan's nightmares, but also his steady progress, his deep bond with Cameron and Sable. When Cameron spoke, her voice trembled at first. I've known what it is to lose family, she said quietly, and I've learned how to start again. This ranch was just a place to hide from pain, but now it's home because of them, because of Ethan and Sable and the love we've found. The judge asked hard questions. Why should Ethan stay here? What if his mother returned? What if Cameron wasn't strong enough? Cameron looked to Ethan. The boy leaned into her side, Sable's lucky charm clutched in his hand. We're a family, she said, voice growing stronger. We may not look like other families, but we heal each other. We belong together. Linda's final words carried the weight of what she'd seen. I believe this is a place where healing is real. I recommend approval for foster guardianship. The judge studied them for a long, silent moment. Then, with a nod, he spoke. Approved, a breath that Cameron hadn't realized she'd been holding, finally escaped. Ethan threw his arms around her, and even Sable waiting outside the courthouse seemed to know. She tossed her head, whinnying into the spring air. For the first time, they were not just surviving. They were together. They were home. Late spring spread itself across the Montana ranch like a gentle hand. The pastures blazed with wildflowers, purple lupine, yellow arrowleaf balsam root, and the tall pink spires of fireweed, all shimmering in the sun. After so many months of snow and silence, the world felt born again. Every window in the house was open, carrying in the smells of grass and earth, the calls of meadowlarks, and above it all, the sound of laughter. Cameron sat on the porch steps, her coffee growing cold beside her, watching Ethan run through the field with Sable at his heels. The mare's coat shone, her old scars almost hidden beneath the sleek gloss of new hair. Ethan, barefoot and grinning, was holding a string of wildflowers he'd woven for Sable's mane. His laughter was no longer shy or uncertain. It was loud, infectious, filling the air with pure, living joy. Linda, the caseworker, had come to check on them one last time, but now she lingered on the porch, her clipboard forgotten. She watched the scene unfold, a soft smile on her lips. "Hard to believe it's only been a few months," Linda said quietly. "This place feels different, lighter." Cameron nodded, her gaze never leaving Ethan and Sable. "Sometimes it doesn't even feel real. I look at them, and I remember how broken we all were. Ethan wouldn't speak. Sable flinched if you touched her. I couldn't let anyone in. Not really. But they changed that." Linda watched her, gentle but direct. "How do you think it happened?" Cameron thought for a long moment, tracing the rim of her mug. "I think we let ourselves hope, even when it hurt, even when it seemed foolish. I started believing that family could be a choice, not just something you lose, but something you fight to build." Down in the field, Ethan tripped and fell, laughing as Sable nudged him gently upright with her nose. He dusted himself off, unbothered, and looped another garland of flowers around the mare's neck. Cameron's chest tightened with a bittersweet ache, a deep, almost holy gratitude for what they had survived together. She turned to Linda. "You asked me back at the hearing if I'd be strong enough. I'm not sure I am, not all the time. But I know I don't have to be alone. That's what's different now." Linda nodded. "You've all healed. It's not perfect, but it's real. That's what matters." Cameron looked out at the field, Ethan twirling with his arms wide, Sable tossing her head, sunlight caught in her mane. She realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of failing, not of losing. The old wounds still ached some days, but they were scars now, not open cuts. Ethan ran back toward the porch, cheeks flushed, breathless with excitement. "Look, Cameron! Sable likes the flowers!" Sable trotted behind him, a living garland of spring, her eyes bright and clear. Cameron opened her arms, and Ethan flung himself into her hug, warm and solid and real. Sable stood close, lowering her head so Ethan could stroke her nose. The three of them, a makeshift family, wrapped in the gold of late afternoon. Linda stepped off the porch, her voice kind but a little wistful. "There are a lot of kids who never get this chance. A lot of people who never find their way home." Cameron touched her shoulder. "Maybe it only takes one person willing to risk a little hope, or one horse brave enough to go looking for someone lost." They stood together, quiet for a moment, letting the simple peace of the place sink in. Cameron knelt to look Ethan in the eyes. "You know, people say families are born, but I think they're made. We choose each other. We heal together. Even the broken parts." Ethan nodded, solemn as a preacher. "Are we always going to be together?" She pulled him close, her heart full. "As long as we keep choosing each other, yes. That's what makes us family." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and lavender, Cameron sat on the porch with Ethan nestled against her side and Sable cropping grass nearby. She watched the world soften into evening, grateful for every hard-won moment. She thought of Jessica, Ethan's mother, and hoped that somewhere she too was finding her way toward healing. She thought of her own lost years and how kindness, unexpected, difficult, persistent, had stitched her back together. As fireflies winked in the tall grass, Cameron reflected on all they had learned. Second chances are never wasted. Healing takes time, and trust grows in small, stubborn ways. Sometimes, it's the ones who are most lost, child, horse, or grieving woman, who teach us what it really means to belong. Her final thought, watching her new family illuminated by the last light of day. When you find the courage to let someone in, you both become whole. Cameron squeezed Ethan's hand and called to the viewers, her voice gentle and sure. If this story moved you, remember, hope and healing can start with a single, compassionate choice. Please like and follow to hear more stories of second chances. The camera would fade, but the love on that Montana ranch, fierce, messy, real, would carry on. Every sunset, every spring, every small act of trust that made three broken souls into something whole.